AP research project, I studied how Division I universities and colleges promote and foster inclusivity and diversity within their golf programs. In the past 14 years, there has been a multitude of efforts towards increasing diversity and creating a more welcoming environment in the golf industry. In 2010, Zippia conducted a study of all workers in the golf industry that were employed. In the United States, 63% of these golfers were women. When the same study was conducted in 2021, the statistic had significantly worsened. 11 years later, the roles were reversed, and men now take the lead of the most employed golfers at 72%. This statistic sparked my inspiration to understand diversity within the golf industry, specifically at the Division I collegiate level, to determine if the demographics of the colleges will also show a major discrepancy. For this project, I focused on answering the question, how can colleges and universities promote inclusivity and diversity within their golf programs to attract a more representative range of participants? To break down this question, I wanted to find the boundaries of what inclusivity and diversity means. For the context of this presentation, inclusivity means ensuring that there is a welcoming and accessible environment. Diversity for this project is racial and gender diversity. I will be determining if a school's golf team is representative of the overall student population based on how closely it correlates to the student population as a whole. For this project, I drew my inspiration as being a golfer and also as a female who has both witnessed and experienced firsthand the disappointing demographics that stand in this industry. With this last year in AP seminar, I discovered how collegiate athletes, following a traumatic physical injury, acquire resilience, and despite the fact that I don't believe that diversity or a lack of has any impact on on a person's physical self, I do think that there is something to be said about how an athlete feels on their team if there is a lack of diversity present. To better understand the existing literature on this topic, I examined a wide variety of current scholarly works that researched different populations and factors within the industry. The initial studies I came across, conducted by Wood and Farrell and Dalenchuk, had three pillars that were at the forefront of their studies: diversity, equity, and inclusion. These two studies acknowledged that there are a multitude of challenges present towards attaining these attributes, one of which being both a perceived and a reality of male dominance, a perception of golf only being accessible to higher classes as well as it only being advertised to higher classes, and geographical imbalances that can impact the weather and drastically change the length of a golf season. Another study I examined to determine my gap was a study done by McGinnis et al., which investigated the ritualistic behaviors of male golfers and how their actions perpetuate male dominance within the industry. With this, the study also observed the perceptions and stereotypes of golfers and how this contributes and perpetuates the long-standing gender imbalances. With this, the study also observed how these stereotypes can prolong diversity and actually build mental barriers for those who feel they don't fit the mold of what a golfer should be. The other main study I used to formulate my topic was one done by One et al., which investigated the factors that influenced how golfers chose a course, which specifically focused on how race becomes a part of making this decision. The study found that despite diversity initiatives, golfers are still hesitant to join a club that has high diversity due to racist perceptions. Since racially diverse golfers feel they are unable to be welcomed by these communities, the long-standing racial demographics are not being remedied at this point. Despite providing valuable insight into the professional conversation of diversity in golf, these sources are missing two important details. There has not been a study that focuses on the demographic landscape of collegiate golf and the factors of recruiting that may affect these statistics. With this gap in mind, my research project focused on the population of collegiate golfers without taking into account geographic information and addresses common themes in recruiting that may have an effect on the demographic composition of a team. To form my hypotheses, I kept 3 ideas in mind to guide me. I knew that I would most likely find a prevailing underrepresentation of certain demographics in collegiate golf. I also knew that not all colleges have a women's golf team, and I assumed that recruiting strategies would have some sort of impact on diversity outcomes. My first hypothesis is that significant disparity exists in the racial and gender composition of Division I golf teams and the student body as a whole. My second hypothesis is that if a college is ranked in the top 25% of NCSA power rankings, and they also field a women's golf team, they will in turn have a more racially and genderly complex composition. My third hypothesis is colleges that follow a recruiting checklist, which I formulated by analyzing a set of sample schools. If they have a high score on this recruiting checklist, that will also equate to having more diversity. These 3 hypotheses all lead to determining rates of inclusivity and diversity. With this, while formulating my methodology, I kept my goal of analyzing race and gender for a collection of golfers from varying colleges to ensure my project directly answered my research question. For my methodology, I determined that I needed to collect a lot of demographic data to ensure that my findings were transferable to the general collegiate golf population, which also meant that random sampling was essential, as I was not going to analyze every single player. Since I had to deal with an overwhelming amount of data, I also determined that I needed an effective way to interpret it all. As I was running trials to determine exactly what I was going to do for my methodology, I ran into my first roadblock, which was that demographic data was not disclosed on the collegiate golf team level. With this, upon contacting the NCAA, they defined this undisclosure as a privacy concern, and I knew that I had to find another outlet to analyze race, as this was a major part of my project. So after extensive research, I found a methodology to estimate race without it being self-reported. This methodology is called the Rand Bayesian Improved Surname Geocoding Methodology, which takes 2 factors into account to estimate a person's race. It takes their surname, which is then inputted into a database to determine the origin of that last name, and in turn the race that goes along with it. And it also takes into account geocoding, which in this case, I took each player's zip code of their high school, which I then inputted into the US Census to see what the majority race for that zip code was. Based on these 2 outputs, I determined what the individual player's race most likely was, and if these 2 outcomes were differing, each race that I determined from either the surname or the geocoding was worth 50% of that player's race for statistical purposes. Starting my actual research, I determined I wanted to select 16 different schools. So I knew that I wanted to pick an even number from the top 25% of NCSA rankings and the bottom 25% of NCSA power rankings. So I randomly selected 8 from each of these 25. To collect my data, I created 2 Google Forms. The first Google form was about basic school information, whether the institution was public or private, if it was in a rural or an urban area, information about the student body population size, and also the percentage of white students on that college campus. The second form that I used was just to run through my data on each player. So this form included all of the information that I needed to run my range BISG methodology. Also included in the first form was my recruiting checklist, which was out of 25 points. Now for my results. First, this chart represents the percentage of white players or white students in the overall student population of each institution. And this chart represents the number of white players on the school's golf team. As you can see, by comparing these 2 charts, there is a major discrepancy between the percentage of white players and the overwhelming percentage of white players on each golf team. which supports my first hypothesis. This chart represents the gender composition of each school's golf teams, which is shockingly balanced for the most part, with only 2 schools of the 16 that I've randomly selected not having a women's golf team at all. This chart represents the racial diversity for all of the golf teams that I analyzed, which shows that white is at 86%, there are 12% Asians, and 2% Black. And as I hypothesized, the top 25% ranking schools shows a slightly greater level of diversity, with Asians now being at 19%, Black still being at 2%, and white being at a slightly less number of 78%. The bottom 25% ranking schools were 90% white, meaning schools with less diversity potentially corresponds to a lower ranking. The overall gender composition shows a relatively even distribution, with men at 58% and women at 42%. Again, the top 25% schools show better diversity statistics, with men being at 53% and women being at 47%, which is almost a perfect split. The lower ranking schools show a worse level of gender diversity, with men at 60% and women at 40%, which follows the same trend as their race demographics. The final piece of data that I collected to prove my hypotheses was the score each college received on the checklist I generated to see how welcoming and accessible their recruiting process was. This was out of 25 points, however most schools scored around 10 points. The schools that were higher ranking on this checklist also corresponded to their ranking on NCSA, and they were schools that were in the top 25%. And then, to ensure that my methodology was accurate, I determined the statistics for each of the players I analyzed, and I saw if their surname and geographic race matched, as well as if their perceived race, based solely on a picture that was on their roster profile, matched the race that I had assumed that they had. I concluded that for this project, the RAND VISG methodology was 82% successful in estimating race, which I consider to be pretty accurate considering the limitations that are in place with this method. All in all, I learned that there is a major discrepancy between the racial demographic composition of collegiate golf teams and their respective schools. I also determined that there is not an overwhelming predominance of male golfers, at least at the collegiate level. Since my results are so severely skewed towards white, it is hard to see if my hypotheses are entirely proven to be correct. If there was a less predominance of white players, there would be more of a discrepancy illustrated, I believe, but since all of these statistics for white players are so high to begin with, it is difficult to see if there's any true correlations. My research serves to further the understanding of inclusivity and diversity within the golf industry, and I hope the implications of my findings serve as a guiding force towards more investigation of how to promote and foster an inclusive and diverse environment within an industry that is known for being the opposite. Thank you, and I would like to open it for questions.
Well done. How did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
So when I collected all of my data, I had a lot of data, and I had to really assess which was going to be the most valuable. So since I had initially analyzed the entire racial demographics of the college student population as a whole, I determined that since the majority race for every single golf team was white, I was just going to include the percentage of white students and compare it to the percentage of white students on the golf team for my comparative analysis, to make it a little bit more simple and also also just since that was the defining factor that I was studying.
How do your findings provide directions for future research in the field?
My research opens avenues for future studies to delve deeper into specific aspects of diversity and inclusion within collegiate golf, and also I was unable to investigate the direct impact of things like mentorship programs and diversity initiatives, and also the intersectionality of race, gender, and socioeconomic status. And I also think that more studies that can track the implementation of diversity initiatives in collegiate golf can provide long-term effectiveness and sustainability towards creating a more inclusive future.
If you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
I think that the main issue that I ran into with my entire research process was that I wanted to research a wide spectrum of things, and I think that if I were to revisit my research process and potentially start over from the beginning again, I would definitely define these boundaries a little bit more for myself, as well as ensure that there was going to be a simple and efficient way for me to collect all of my data, because I ran into a significant amount of roadblocks with analyzing the race, and then also since recruiting websites are not standardized, that also became an issue. So I think that I would really define my boundaries and ensure that I had a focused topic from the start so that I didn't run into roadblocks and then have to entirely shift my process.
Thank you.